A forgotten child from Peter Pan may have grown into the shadow-wielding villain we meet in The Princess and the Frog. Neverland doesn't appear anywhere in The Princess and the Frog, but the evidence does if you know where to look, because both Peter Pan and Dr. Facilier command shadows in ways that no other Disney character ever does. Peter's shadow runs loose and disobedient, full of its own life, while Facilier's obeys every syllable he speaks. And that difference is not a coincidence, but an evolution across decades of bitter practice. One lost boy stayed behind when Peter stopped coming back, aging slowly in a place that was never built for aging, and the resentment that grew in him hardened first into ritual, then into something that defied any innocent name. Magic didn't find the Shadow Man the way it finds other Disney characters through birthright or blessing. He forged it himself, pulling it up from abandonment and bitterness the way you pull water from a poisoned well. Peter Pan never went back to account for the boys he left behind, which means every lost boy who stayed is unaccounted for. And Facilier didn't come from New Orleans at all. He came from a childhood that swallowed him whole, because Neverland doesn't preserve innocence. It weaponizes it. By the time Belle arrives in Beauty and the Beast, the castle may already be hiding the evidence of failed attempts. Belle wasn't the first person to walk through those gates, and nobody ever stops to ask that question, even though the answer is written into every scratch on the West Wing walls. The enchantment lasted years, long enough for the rose to shed most of its petals, long enough for a monstrous prince hidden inside a massive enchanted estate to become something of a local rumor, because word travels and curious people wander toward exactly the kind of mystery they shouldn't. Others came before Belle, some of them probably invited in with the desperate hope that finally, this one would be the one. And the shattered mirrors and the furniture that refuses to speak about certain years are the only record left of how those attempts ended. By the time Belle arrived, the Beast had already tried and failed too many times to believe that love was still something available to him, which means she didn't save a prince who was still fighting his curse with everything he had, but saved one who had completely given up. Belle wasn't lucky. She was simply the last one the enchantment had left to send. If these hidden Disney connections are blowing your mind already, hit subscribe because we're only getting started. The storm in Frozen may not have ended a bloodline. It may have displaced it into the jungle of Tarzan. The ship left Arendelle and never arrived anywhere, with the official record listing both passengers as lost at sea and presumed dead, and that one word carries the entire theory inside it, presumed. The creators hinted at it publicly, and the art direction of both films whispers a connection that was never made explicit on screen, pointing toward two survivors who reached an unfamiliar shore, built something from nothing, and had a son who grew up with no language that maps to royalty and no memory of the kingdom he should have inherited. Elsa spent her whole life hiding a crown she never chose, and Anna spent hers searching for the kind of connection she couldn't name, while their brother simply spent his believing he had no family at all. He should have ruled. Instead, the jungle raised a ghost. Long before the betrayal in The Lion King, something happened that never healed. Ambition is the easy explanation for Scar, and it is also the wrong one, because the deleted scenes from The Lion King suggest something far more corrosive sitting underneath all that political hunger. There's a version of this story where Scar doesn't just want the throne, but wants Nala, where he pursues her openly and she refuses him in front of witnesses. A prince rejected by someone beneath his station in the kind of moment that doesn't disappear, but calcifies into something that shapes every decision that follows. Every cruel word, every calculated betrayal, every obsessive move toward power traces back far enough to find a single humiliation he never recovered from. And the Pride Lands didn't create a tyrant through ambition alone, but through wounded pride that was never allowed to heal. Nobody chose him, so he spent the rest of his life making sure to take everything they valued instead. And that is not villainy so much as grief that learned how to wear a crown. The most unsettling part of all is that Scar was not born with that name, that somebody gave it to him, and that something happened well before the story we were shown, leaving him already beyond repair by the time we first see him standing in the shadow of his brother's glory. The brief backstory in Wreck-It Ralph may hide a detail too disturbing to linger on. She's the toughest soldier in her universe, and the movie offers her backstory in under 30 seconds before moving on. But the detail it glosses over is the one that changes everything about who she became. A bug crashed her wedding. Her fiancé was attacked, and she fired. Which sounds like tragedy, until you remember that bugs don't simply kill their victims, but consume them, absorbing and transforming into whatever they devour. Which means that when she raised her weapon, the monster was already wearing his face. In the half-second between recognizing what she was looking at and pulling the trigger, something in her had to make a calculation that no person should ever be asked to make. And whether she knew in that moment or only understood it afterward is the question the movie carefully refuses to answer. She was not forged in boot camp or in battle, but in one breath, one heartbeat, one choice that sealed a wound so permanently shut that she never hesitated again in any situation, because hesitation had already cost her everything it could possibly take. She fired. The bug fell, and she has lived every day since then knowing exactly what that creature had consumed before she stopped it. The sea witch of The Little Mermaid may have once ruled far closer to the surface. She wasn't born in the ocean trenches, but was exiled there, and the power she commands reads nothing like learned magic, but instead like inherited authority that has been forced to wear a darker coat for survival. The way she negotiates is the most telling detail, not like a criminal who stumbled into leverage, but like someone who has run courts before, someone who understands the specific weight of contracts and clauses and the theatrical control of every exchange. Because that kind of precision only comes from having once held genuine power and having it stripped away. She was banished, stripped of title, and forced to the ocean floor, while the kingdom above her continued without a second thought. And so crowns became contracts, and subjects became collateral. And the cave full of shrunken lost souls became her throne room, rebuilt entirely from ruin. Every claimed soul a proof of concept that she still commanded something worth fearing. She wasn't wrong that she had been wronged, and every deal she ever made was leverage stacked against the day she could reclaim what was taken. Which means the real question is not whether Ursula was the villain of this story, but whether the kingdom that cast her out deserved the ending it got. A fall in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs may not have been the end, only the beginning of something quieter and tangled. Nobody confirmed the body after the evil queen fell, and the vultures circled, and the dwarves wept, and the camera cut away before anyone could be certain, leaving open the possibility that something broken and ancient and still breathing crawled toward the one thing it had always needed most. Then a golden flower appears in a distant kingdom, offering healing magic that is eternal if maintained. And suddenly, there are two villains, separated by a century, but sharing the exact same obsession with beauty and youth, and the verdict of a mirror. The evil queen asked who was fairest, while Mother Gothel simply locked the answer in a tower, which is vanity that has learned to be more careful rather than vanity that has died. And the pattern between Snow White and Rapunzel is too precise to be coincidence. Nobody connected them because generations passed and history moved on, but she never did, because she never does. Before the lamp in Aladdin, there was a man who had been watching the throne for years. He didn't crave power out of greed, but out of something far more dangerous, which is contempt for the people who already held it, and spent it carelessly while the streets beneath them suffered for the waste. Picture Jafar young in Agrabah's gutters, watching the palace from the outside and observing rulers make catastrophic decisions from behind gold curtains, being sharper and more strategic and more observant than every single one of them, while remaining completely invisible to the people doing the actual governing. Magic wasn't something he pursued for wonder or glory, but for armor, a guarantee built spell by spell that he would never again be powerless or subject to someone else's incompetence. And the lamp was never about greed, but about certainty, because absolute power meant permanent protection from ever returning to nothing. Here is the detail that should genuinely disturb you. He wasn't wrong about the incompetence around him, because the Sultan was oblivious, the council was corrupt, and the palace had been hollowed out by generations of comfort, while Jafar alone saw it all with perfect clarity. He just chose to conquer the sickness rather than cure it, and became the cure that killed the patient. The lamp in Aladdin may not be a cage, but a safeguard. 10,000 years is not a prison term, but a divine sentence. And the difference matters enormously once you start asking the question that nobody in the movie ever asks. What exactly he did to earn it? The genie himself won't say, and if you watch carefully, every joke, every deflection, every manic and dazzling performance reads as something burying a truth too large to speak directly. Because phenomenal cosmic power is not an exaggeration, but a precise description of what he is and what he was capable of before the lamp. Imagine that power operating without a lamp, without rules, without any master to bind the wishes to a limit of 3. Remember that civilizations rose and fell throughout history at the hands of far lesser beings than a reality-bending entity with no constraints at all. Which means that something older and more powerful eventually made a calculation and decided the lamp was not a cage, but a containment device, installed for reasons that were entirely justified. Every wish is supervised, every miracle monitored. Every laugh and song and beautiful performance is the output of a being of incalculable power that has learned to perform contentment about its chains. And the chains were earned. Whether something capable of that level of damage should ever be fully freed is a question the movie treats as a happy ending. But Aladdin may have made the single most consequential mistake in his world's history without anyone in that universe ever realizing it. The ocean's choice in Moana may have been made in the dark long before anyone realized. The wave should have taken her because she was a toddler standing at the shoreline during a storm, and when the water surged and then retreated and laid shells gently at her feet, it wasn't an act of kindness, but an act of recognition towards something the ocean had already decided about her. Consider a version of that night where the wave did take her, where there was one breath underwater in the dark before the ocean made its choice and returned her not as a survivor, but as something that had been briefly claimed and then deliberately released back into the living world with a purpose already embedded, which her parents would spend years mistaking for nothing more than stubbornness. Every time she called to the sea and it answered, every path it cleared and storm it stilled and course it corrected, that was not magic, but a debt being honored according to terms agreed to at age 2 in the dark and the cold, which she signed without knowing and has been living out ever since. A donkey left behind in Pinocchio may have wandered into another story entirely. Pleasure Island transforms boys into donkeys, and that is not metaphor, but documented canon that plays out on screen in Pinocchio, with Lampwick going through hooves and ears and a voice going wrong, while Pinocchio barely escapes and the other fully transformed boys are loaded onto carts and sold to whoever will take them. Most of them were sold, but one of them ran. Too small and slow and broken to move quickly, but just fast enough to disappear into a forest where nobody thought to look. And that is where a child named Christopher Robin eventually found a donkey alone in the woods, whose sadness read less like personality and more like memory. The memory isn't clear, but sits fractured and muffled beneath years of transformation. A name and a day before the island, and something irretrievable that was taken. And he doesn't mention his tail falling off as a running joke, but because losing pieces of himself is the only continuity he has ever had access to, the one constant in a life that was taken from him before he was old enough to understand what was happening. He can't explain any of it, because no one speaks donkey, and so he carries it alone in a gray body in a yellow wood, while everyone around him mistakes his grief for temperament. During Hellfire in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, something appears and disappears faster than most people notice. This one doesn't speculate, but simply asks you to watch the scene more carefully than you did the first time, because during Hellfire, Frollo is not performing his prayer, but genuinely terrified of himself in a way that reads as a man begging to be stopped before he goes further than he can come back from. The flames move in response to his words. The figures in the fire shift with awareness, and something inside that cathedral is unmistakably listening to what he says. And then, Esmeralda escapes and the fire dims, and right there in that moment of dimming is something very easy to miss. A door, a prayer acknowledged, a madness briefly interrupted, a threshold between obsession and retreat that appeared to him as clearly as anything else in that scene, and he stood at it and turned away from the exit. The theory is not that Frollo was a man beyond redemption, but that redemption appeared to him mid-song in the form of a door that he consciously chose not to walk through. He could have let the fire die, but chose to feed it instead, not through fate or curse or dark magic compelling him forward, but through a decision made in full awareness of what that decision meant. That is the most terrifying thing about him. Not what he was, but that he could see exactly what he was becoming and kept going anyway. Which origin do you believe, and which one should have stayed buried? Like if this kept you up tonight, and subscribe for more content.